Londonderry is Northern Ireland's second city and home to over 100,000 people. At the core of the city lies the River Foyle, a powerful and majestic waterway around which much of Derry's history has revolved since its pre-Christian foundation. Today the river is much more than a historical talking point. It is also a barrier. The heart of the city lies on the Foyle's west bank, universally known as the city side, and home to the city centre and its historic walls. On the east bank is Derry's waterside. On the city side today, the Protestant population stands at around 500 people. 40 years ago, it was home to over 15,000. This is their story.
Well, you don't leave your home, you don't leave your place of your livelihood unless you've got a very good reason.
Well, if that wasn't fear, what was? If that wasn't threat, what was?
I think that's as low as you can get whenever you can gun down people coming out of their place of worship on a Sunday morning.
The Protestant community's view was that this was a deliberate, coordinated and brutal assault on their community, their religious beliefs, their traditions and their outlook.
Ever since the Siege of Derry in 1689, Londonderry has held a special place in the Unionist psyche. During that siege, the city's Protestant population endured and triumphed in a 105-day standoff with the besieging Jacobite Catholic forces. The Maiden City, so called because her walls remained unbreached throughout the siege, was a beacon for the steadfast determination of the Irish Protestant settlers of the 17th century to remain in the land that they had come to call home.
It's almost as if in one small corner of Northern Ireland, the battle for liberty was fought before we got to the Boyne. So that's why the siege and the unbreached walls were so important and are so important in the whole psyche of the Protestant community.
Following partition in 1921 and under the arrangements for local government drawn up for the newly created Northern Ireland, the city was to be governed by the Londonderry Corporation, with voting allocation and electoral boundaries apparently designed to ensure perpetual Protestant control in the city, despite its having a significant Catholic majority.
When it comes to electing the local council of Londonderry, the council that runs the affairs of the city, we have a rather odd situation. The total Unionist vote in Londonderry is 9,000. And these votes put a total of 12 members in the city council. The total nationalist vote is 14,000. And these votes put in 8 members. Now note the curious situation. Most of the voters in Londonderry are nationalist, but the council is controlled by the Unionists.
Frustration at the perceived inequity of the Londonderry Corporation had festered for years, but in 1968 it finally developed into protests that burst onto the city streets.
The people of Londonderry have suffered gerrymandering, a lack of jobs, 5,800 people unemployed, no homes, people living in hovels. No one has bothered to do anything about it. In 12 months, 8 houses were built by Londonderry Corporation. The people are retaliating now, and my prediction for the next few days and weeks is that the civil strife is going to continue until such times as the people of Derry get their rights.
As a democratic principle, I believe in the principle of one man, one vote. We would be prepared to accept it. We do accept it in principle. Our fear is that in the working out of it, one could very well be in the position that injustices could be reversed.
Now it was a them and us situation because civil rights demonstrators were accusing the corporation of and the government of favouritism towards the Protestant community. And nobody that I knew, not including myself obviously, could see any examples of this favouritism because we were second class or third class citizens.
Once the police attacked the civil rights movement, and I suspect that not within the police perhaps, but within the unionist establishment, that there was an element of calculation about this. Once the police physically assaulted the civil rights movement, the issue very quickly became, or at least part of the issue, became partly a campaign against the state. And when that happened, of course, the traditional dividing line between the Catholic and Protestant communities came into play.
For many Protestants, the Royal Ulster Constabulary were the embodiment of the Northern Ireland state that they had fought for, and support for the police was virtually unconditional. As a result, the situation in the city took on an overtly sectarian dimension, with Unionists finding themselves in opposition to the actions, if not necessarily the cause, of the civil rights protesters.
There would have been some Protestants who saw themselves under threat and would retaliate. They saw the civil rights as a Republican-oriented movement, and that would have meant that they would have had an obligation to attack them. That was the nature of thinking at that particular time.
Tensions came to a head in August 1969 with the Battle of the Bogside. Over a 3-day period, nationalists rioted with such intensity that the RUC had to be withdrawn from the Bogside area, and the British Army called onto the streets to replace them. This event sent shockwaves through unionism. Protestants on the ground feared that the apparent defeat of the police force that they supported would leave them isolated and vulnerable. These fears were compounded with the first reports that Protestants in and around the Bogside had been threatened and intimidated as the rioting was underway, with some told to leave their homes.
I was really scared because the activity seemed to be coming onto the streets, and the streets were being taken over by people that I didn't recognise anymore. Certainly not my own neighbours, and certainly not the people I grew up with. And there was a great fear then within Protestants, and there was a fear that we would have to leave our homes.
And I remember my mother telling me in August '69 that cousins of hers were coming to stay with us. I was only 16. I was only beginning to become aware because of the problems that were right there and then, that very day, in those few days, beginning to explode across the river. But I then discovered that the reason the cousins were coming to stay with us because they had been put out of their homes near the Bogside in Bishop Street area.
I remember going there sort of with another member of the Labour Party and knocking on the doors of Protestant people. We thought we ought to do something about this and saying to them, look, the people who did this don't represent the civil rights movement, they don't represent the majority of people in the Bogside, we will stand by you and so forth. And I remember I issued a statement in the local press at that time denouncing the attacks on Protestant people and assuring them of our solidarity with them. And I was absolutely taken aback when I discovered that the reaction to my statement by the Protestant people was that I shouldn't have said it, that I was drawing attention to their situation. They were quite angry with me. I remember sort of standing at doorsteps when about half a dozen Protestant people in a little narrow street off Bishop Street, sort of, and them saying to me, you're interfering with us. I mean, leave us alone, leave us alone. I said, but I'm defending you, and so on. He says, we don't want you to defend us. You're just drawing attention to it. There'll be more attacks. You see, and in a way, they were right.
The worst fears of many Protestants on the city side were realised on the 25th of September 1969. William King, a middle-aged father from the Fountain estate, was caught up in sectarian rioting in the city centre and beaten by Catholic youths. He died later that day.
It was then that I noticed the difference in a lot of people, the harder line that they were taking and associating themselves with loyalist groups in Belfast, and wanted to take the same sort of stance of creating, for instance, in the Fountain, London Street Fountain area, a no-go area.
I would have gone quite frequently across to the Fountain Estate, and I remember helping to man the barricades as a result of William King's death. And I mean, barriers going up and barricades going up in unionist areas was unheard of at that point. That was just unprecedented. But it was symbolic of the way in which people were thinking, that there was a threat to their physical safety and they could die, so therefore they wanted some sense of security.
William King's funeral was attended by over 2,000 people and had a sobering effect in the city. Combined with the events of that August, it represented a watershed for the Protestant population of the cityside. Could they really feel safe in their homes anymore?
We moved up here, the family moved up here in 1951, I think it was. I'm trying to think, 1951, yeah. And we lived here until 1984. None of the residents here now are from the original residents, you know. It's completely changed as far as I know in this street in particular.
I lived in the Glen Estate in the aluminium bungalows, and the mix of the population around that time I would have considered was 85 to maybe 85 Protestant and 15% maybe Catholic. That's my perception of it anyway. And it was a happy community before 1969.
I grew up with quite a lot of Catholics, but we went about our business. Mary Bradley, for example, the councillor, lived in Foyle Road, and Mary and I were very good friends. She went to her school and I went to mine, but nobody ever pointed it out as an issue.
In places like Cregan, where there was a very small Protestant population, and certainly all the Protestant families would have been known, they would have been seen to be Protestants because they had their practice of going to their own churches on Sunday, so they were seen to go to church. They were seen to have interests perhaps that didn't tally with those of their nationalist neighbours. For example, there was the secretary of a Linfield supporters club living in a street in Cregan. There were members of flute bands that would have marched on the 12th of July, and of course there were a number of members of the Ulster Special Constabulary living in places like the Cregan estate.
Everybody seemed to look after one another, and it wasn't indeed till the trouble started that you seen then, all of a sudden you realised there is a difference between everybody, and you know, it wasn't just not all about going to different churches and, you know, having different religious views. It was something that was coming up, it was more serious than that.
The Londonderry Corporation had been effectively discredited by the civil rights movement and was replaced in April 1969 by a development commission. This was followed by reforms to end gerrymandering and multiple vote allocation and the restructuring of the RUC. In addition, the British Army remained on the streets and Westminster was questioning Stormont's authority to govern Northern Ireland. All of this combined to threaten the very essence of Unionist identity in the city. It was not until January 1972 that the grim reality of the conflict finally reached Derry's streets, as the IRA embarked on their campaign in the city with the killing of 2 RUC officers outside the Rosemount barracks. With the killings came a tangible sense of fear.
The policemen ran into a hail of machine gun fire when they drove up Cregan Road, as they did most mornings about the same time, towards the Rosemount RUC station.
The gunman fired a burst of machine gun fire which hit the side of the car, and shortly afterwards another gunman fired from another alleyway a few more yards up the road.
At Derry Police Headquarters later, the Union Jack was flown at half-mast for the 2 dead men.
The poignancy of their murder was that the Protestant community even more so began to feel this campaign is directed very, very significantly at us. Our West Bank presence is under threat. We're being pursued. That's the way the Protestant community looked at the attack on anybody in the West Bank.
Once the killing started, the real fear got into people. And I think that's when the significant shift of population came from the working class areas because of that.
In this climate of fear, the reassurances of Catholic neighbours were of little comfort. It was not the neighbours that were feared, but the darker figures in the background, whether real or imagined.
I've talked to many families who moved, and I've said, what made you move? What caused it? Were you threatened? Did you have your windows broken? Did people give you an anonymous call or anonymous letter? And they said, not really. Indeed, they said our neighbours who were Catholic tried to persuade us to stay. But we got frightened. There's fear in the air. There's a kind of atmosphere of fear and threat. And many said we would have managed ourselves as adults, but we were very worried about our children.
And then it got the fear that the kids couldn't go out in the streets. And then you seen people that you knew and that you grew up with, all of a sudden they were all going to Waterside. And it was just awful.
January the 30th, 1972. Bloody Sunday. The killings of 14 marchers by the British Army led to a surge in recruitment to the IRA in Derry as young nationalists sought to avenge the deaths.
It was after Bloody Sunday that Protestants became apprehensive. Up until Bloody Sunday, there were Protestants on areas like Abercorn Road and Barrack Street and Ferguson Street who felt that they were behind the lines of the rioting, and they were getting uneasy, and there was a lot of disquiet there. But the real problem and chill factors didn't come on until after Bloody Sunday.
It was in April. We knew we had to get out because that night our home was attacked in Mountjoy Street, and it was more or less they were outside the house shouting, "Get out, orange bees," and they were banging the door with iron bars. Now I was on my own in the house, and at that time I had 3 kids, and I remember sitting on the stairs, and nobody could get in, no neighbours, and the other Protestant neighbours also felt the fear as well. I wasn't the only one who was targeted at that time. And I remember the next morning when David came home, I was still sitting on the stairs with 3 kids, and they were sleeping. And we lifted them, and then we went down to the house and office at that time was down at the Guildhall, and we just sat there, and we said we couldn't go back to our home much as we wanted to, and we didn't even want to leave our friends, and they were as upset as we were. I'm talking about our Catholic neighbours. They were just as upset that these Protestant neighbours of theirs was being put out. But anyway, they got us a house in New Buildings, and funny enough, when I arrived in New Buildings, my neighbours were Catholics. I couldn't believe it. Here I was getting put out of my home by Catholics, and I landed in New Buildings, and I'm here, both my neighbours are Catholics. It was unbelievable, and what were they all doing? They had put the squatters out of the house, and they were cleaning the house for me coming by these 3 kids. I couldn't believe it, and I thought, that gave me a boost straight away.
For many Protestants, the targeting of members of the RUC and Ulster Defence Regiment by Republicans was viewed in sectarian terms. The vast majority of RUC and UDR officers were Protestants, and an attack on them reverberated throughout the entire Protestant community.
It would have been seen as an extension of shooting Protestants, because the UDR and the police would have been seen as fathers and brothers and husbands and uncles. So it was a personal attack on the Protestant community.
And I didn't tell many people that I was in the UDR. They knew probably, but I kept it low key. But I never felt under threat till maybe after I left the UDR is when I started having problems in that score.
In its first real year, the Republican campaign saw 6 members of the security forces killed in the city. The victims came from both the Catholic and Protestant communities, but the message was the same. Derry was not a safe place to live or work for any security force personnel. By extension, their families also felt themselves to be potential targets.
If you had a family in the police, someone didn't have to come to your door and tell you to get out, They didn't. They just let it be known that they knew your son was in the police. And the people, anybody that owned their homes, sold their homes for very little and moved out. I had no less than 3 very good friends moved inside a month, and it was heartbreaking to see it, because that was the start of the move.
The Protestant community in the city had grown up with the idea that Unionists held power, because Unionists, although they were a minority in the entire city, in political terms, in local government terms, council terms, city council, they dominated. It was a Unionist mayor, it was a Unionist controlled council. And I think when that was totally changed, suddenly changed, Protestants felt, well, our representation is gone. Who's going to speak for us? There was a feeling that we had been left empty, and the wind's blowing through us and we have no shelter.
I literally can't remember a significant or any unionist leader at the time intervening to say anything meaningful to the Protestant people on the west bank of the river. To stay, even in terms of defiance, to stay at your place, they weren't saying that. Neither were they saying, sort of in public anyway, get out. I mean, these Fenians will never tolerate you. I mean, it was consistent with their record that when it came to the crunch, the official Unionist Party fled across the river themselves like a flock of Lundies, you know, leaving sort of the remnants of their own people behind them. Utterly useless, certainly useless to Catholics, I believe utterly useless to Protestants as well.
From this point, the IRA maintained a steady campaign of killing and attempted to kill security forces, both on and off duty, in Londonderry. By 1973, this targeting had been further extended to include civilians who worked in security force bases.
I think the IRA attitude was that Protestants in general were likely to support, indeed were supporters of the British presence in Northern Ireland, were therefore supporters of the police and the army, and therefore people who were likely to inform on their activities. So it was essential for that campaign to succeed, for there to be as few Protestants who were likely to lift the telephone and say, my neighbour is a member of the IRA, or I saw my neighbour carrying a gun, or I saw my neighbour carrying something that looked like a bomb into a car. So essential that they be removed from the equation, and removed by whatever form of intimidation.
No, well, I don't believe that, because when I went to them at that particular time, well, not to them, to Sinn Féin, when I went to them at that particular time and says, you know, the Protestants are leaving, they regretted that as much as any, and they assured me that there was no paramilitary efforts to get Protestants to move.
People did feel that the IRA wanted them to leave, and many people stayed on, but there was an awful lot left. One area in particular was down there by Hog's Folly, and that there was 40 people and families in one night got on the move. And actually, I'm not ashamed to say I assisted them to move, because I realised the situation, you know, and they were moving into semi-derelict bungalows, aluminium bungalows and Browning Drive, but they were done and fixed them up until they were rehoused. They were considered then as squatters. They'd left their legal home to become squatters. Well, if that wasn't fear, what was? If that wasn't threat, what was?
Whilst the impact of attacks on the security forces was very real, it was a targeting of Protestant civilians on the city side that struck further fear into the hearts of the ordinary Protestant population. In December 1975, Lexi Mitchell and Charlie McNall were shot dead in a cafe on the Strand Road. Both were well-known, well-liked family men, and completely unconnected with any security force or paramilitary groups.
One horror after another. I mean, that was, there were two, say, very nice gentlemen. There were two customers that came into the shop regularly, and as I say, Charlie McNall and Mr. Mitchell were, you know, I just couldn't understand why people would want to do that, and what was the purpose.
That appeared to be stepping a gear up again, and that was looked upon as just heaping the pressure on further.
Eventually, the newly emerging INLA admitted the killings, claiming mistaken identity. For many, the sectarian undertone was clear. Within a year of these killings, Joey Glover, a well-known businessman, was shot 9 times in the chest by the IRA as he answered the front door of his city-side office. He was apparently killed in retaliation for a loyalist killing in Eglinton, just outside the city.
The killing of Mr. Joseph Glover here at Crawford Square last night was the latest incident in an apparently growing tide of assassinations which have brought fear to everyone in public and business life in the city of Derry, a city which thought itself hardened to such things. This has been put that, in fact, this is the slaughter of the innocents.
It is, and I suppose the way of it is now, there are people in the town somewhere thumbing through maybe underlining names, people they don't know, families they don't know, and some way must be found of stopping these people.
The IRA was also engaged in a campaign of bombings of city centre businesses. Their rationale was to destroy the economy and make Northern Ireland ungovernable, thus forcing the British government to withdraw. The campaign saw dozens of bombings across the city centre throughout the mid-1970s, leading to large-scale destruction. Whether by accident or by design, targeting businesses in Derry City often meant targeting Protestant-owned property.
And it was very hard to take when you saw your city being bombed, and I mean bombed, absolutely destroyed. You could go over on a Sunday morning and you would walk and you would see Ferricky Street devastated. You saw Shipgate Street devastated, Waterloo Place. But those were, people's perception was these were all Protestant businesses as well. So there was this perception that they were now starting to target Protestant businesses.
I know people who had businesses in the city, who had businesses that they had built up over a lifetime. Those businesses were destroyed. And that is, you know, apart from the politics of any of that, that is a huge impact on a person's life.
One occasion when there was a device left in the shop, which luckily we were able to get out. They exploded it afterwards. There was a bomb in it, or there was a device in it. Luckily it didn't go off. You felt that there were people watching you all the time. As I say, it was a thing, well, you either carried on and did your business and, you know, you did just carried on as best you can and trusted in the good Lord. And that's what a lot of us did.
We had to move out of our home. And at the bottom of Hawkins Street, there was a bomb. We were bombed out. And we had to move to Academy Road. In fact, that's why we took the house on Academy Road, because I thought, if we go to the Waterside, we'll never get back. Well, then I was threatened a lot. I went into the council and I started to get threats there, quite serious threats. And I kept them from my husband for nearly 6 months. And then it got to the stage where one of my neighbours came one night and said, look, there's a boy here with a gun last night looking for you. How real it was, I really don't think there was anyone there with a gun looking for me. But Jim wouldn't take the risk. So he went out the next day and bought the house we're living in now in the Waterside.
Whilst many Protestants did choose to leave and seek safety in numbers in areas where the IRA was less active and less effective, for some to move was to accept that terror had won, and that was simply not an option.
Well, it just didn't occur to me, but I know my aunt wouldn't have left. She wouldn't have wanted to, she wouldn't have thought at all of giving up the shop and being driven out from anywhere. She said, I'm staying here until they carry me out.
I made up my mind at the very beginning that I wasn't going anywhere, that I was staying. You do make a conscientious determination of what way you're going to go and what you're going to do.
Beyond all other Republican actions on the city side, 2 killings, 3 years apart, horrified the Protestant population perhaps more than any. In 1979, David Ray, a member of the RUC Reserve, was killed by the IRA as he walked from his car to Claremont Presbyterian Church on the Northland Road. David Ray's killing was followed in 1982 by that of RUC Inspector Norman Duddy. 2 IRA gunmen shot Duddy as he left Strand Road Presbyterian Church after the Sunday service.
I mean, nothing is so revolting as people going to their place of worship and then to say they're a legitimate target on a Sunday morning. And no matter what your religion is, I think that's as low as you can get whenever you can gun down people coming out of their place of worship on a Sunday morning.
Having long been one of the last remaining RUC officers living on the city side, Duddy had finally moved just 2 weeks before his killing. On the day of his death, he was following the pattern of many Protestants that had left their homes through the Troubles by returning to his home parish to worship. His killing ensured that many Protestants no longer felt safe even to do this, and would therefore rarely enter the city side at all. It was clear that it was not only serving members of the security forces that were under threat in the city side.
And I arrived back at the house one night after leaving my mother over bingo, I think it was, or something, and there was two men at the door, so I went up to them. They looked sort of official, and I went up to them and I asked them who they were, and they said they were RUC detectives. And then they told me that they had found my name among many others, which was a regular occurrence, on a list in a house they raided, and that my life could be in danger, so they were advising me I should make an effort to move out of the state and get somewhere more safe. So you can imagine that was a terrible shock at the time, and at that stage my mother had been diagnosed with having cancer, and this was not a thing she needed to know, because she'd only a matter of months to live, and it was more the worry about that than anything. But I had to tell her, really, but the upset of having to move house then to the water side did not do her any good.
It was not just Republican violence that was undermining Protestant confidence in the city side. The changing political situation of the 1970s and 1980s also had a significant impact. A key issue concerned the name of the city. For many nationalists, the name Londonderry had no legitimacy. For Unionists, Londonderry was legal and binding evidence of the union between Northern Ireland and Britain. For both, the name of the city cut to the heart of their identity and that of their hometown. With nationalist local government assured by the electoral reforms of the civil rights movement, Derry's Catholics had the power to dictate policy. And in 1984, the local authority voted to change its name from Londonderry City Council to Derry City Council.
Is that another thing they're taking from us? And as that, we've been put out of our city, and young Protestants aren't safe in the city, and now they want the name changed, And there was a terrible amount of anger around that.
The emotional temperature last night inside the council debating chamber rose steadily throughout the first hour of their meeting, until the Democratic Unionists walked out, followed a few minutes later by the official Unionists as well.
They took the line, no, it's Londonderry, and that's it. We were suggesting a number of things and this and that. They didn't want to even talk or get involved in any kind of compromise. They says, no, the name of the city is Londonderry, and that's it.
The name issue underlined divisions between unionism and nationalism in the city, leading to the withdrawal for 4 years of Unionists from the council, and highlighting the 7,000 Protestants that had left the city side at that point. At a psychological level, further blows were struck in 1988 and 1989 with the IRA bombings of the Bishop Street Courthouse. In addition to causing widespread destruction to their target, the bombs damaged the Protestant St. Columb's Cathedral and nearby homes.
There was a terrible threat to the whole Protestant community. They felt really threatened that if this can happen in our city or in our country or in the diocese of Derry, well, we might be next in line.
Now, you've been out of your home since the last explosion in August last year.
That's right.
Do you think after last night's attack here by the IRA that you would return to your house?
I don't think so, no. Once bitten, I think. The first was very bad, and I think this has now made up my mind.
In a community stalked by fear and with many of their former neighbours having already left their homes, Protestants became more isolated and felt yet more vulnerable. It was this vicious circle that effectively erased the Protestant population from Derry's city side. As more Protestants left, it became harder for those remaining to stay. By the 1990s, there was only one Protestant community defiantly remaining on the city side, in the Fountain Estate, with a population of less than 500 people.
At the moment, there's 160 houses and 318 persons of all ages. In 1969, the Fountain had a population of just below 2,000. We are a caretaker community, and we have selected to stay here because we have a feeling for the area and a feeling and a dignity for the institutions that we would be part of.
As the conflict wore on, for many in Londonderry, the relationship between Protestants and Catholics in the city came to be defined most prominently through the parading issue. With parades in December and August each year, the apprentice boys became the most visible manifestation of Protestant identity on the city side.
Thousands of apprentice boys and visitors come back because there's a tangible expression there in the walls of our history. So that's why it is so important in the mindset of Protestants.
Within a quarter of a century, the Protestant community on the city side had almost disappeared. It is estimated that between 12 and 18,000 Protestants had gone. In Derry, this meant that up to 1 in 5 of the city's people had left their homes since the Troubles began, effectively transforming virtually the entire cityside area into a Catholic and nationalist heartland. As Londonderry has come to terms with this altered reality, the political situation on the ground and in government has changed radically. With an end to violence and a virtual resolution to the parading issue in the city, community relations have improved and attitudes have slowly begun to change. As Derry looks to the future, there is even speculation of a renaissance for Protestantism on the city side and a growing sense of optimism.
I'm delighted that you're here to share in this formal new start, new beginning.
Numbers are starting to increase and people value the fact that they can come back to a church perhaps that they had previously attended and for a variety of reasons had stopped coming, now feel that they can come and enjoy worship where they used to.
Relations between Protestants and Catholics were never better than what they are now. Even in the 50s and the 60s where there was an apparent community spirit, I think there's a lot of hope.
For some on the Unionist side, the Exodus story has provided clear evidence of sectarianism and intolerance, with Londonderry's Protestants being driven forcibly from their homes by their Catholic neighbours. For many of Derry's nationalists, the Exodus casts a dark shadow over the city. But there is a conviction that their ordinary Protestant neighbours were not threatened, and an uncomfortable acceptance that those connected to the security forces certainly were. The reality may not have been so clear-cut on either side, but the impact has been universal. The city has been changed forever, and regardless of what the future may hold, will never be the same again.
It doesn't make me angry anymore. It's just a chapter of your life that you move on. And if you started thinking about anger all the time, you would never move on.
It may be slow, but I would foresee the day when Protestants would be happy and feel comfortable to come back to the West Bank.
I resented leaving the city side because it was my city, it still is. I'm in that city centre every day and it'll be a good and it'll move me, you know. But I'm sad to say that there's many others have never went back.
I was born in Londonderry. I was born in Derry City too. Oh, what a special child to see such things and still